teaching the child how to manage distress. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. Absolutely.
So if we're going to talk about why it is important for parents to develop resilience around what's going on with their child medically, and we are going to talk about self-care and the parent, we're not just talking about go get a bubble bath. We're talking about, when there is a stressful situation, does that parent have the ability in their current situation to manage the distress and then can discharge the anxiety of the situation after the stressful situation has passed?
So moving in and out of these medical traumas, yes.
It is moving in and out of emergencies, which is a big part of what is going on initially. Both, not just emergencies in terms of
medical life-threatening.
Right. You're learning whether or not what you're seeing, the movement your child is doing is a seizure, right? I mean, how many of us post videos trying to figure out what we're seeing?
Right.
In those initial kind of times.
You're always watching them.
Right. And then we're figuring out what to do with the whole Sabril thing of, is my child going to lose their peripheral vision, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
What does this mean? Right. There's lots of scary words on labels that we're reading.
Right.
And then we're also doing all of the circumstantial situational setup stuff, like figuring out how to make sure that the child's medication gets refilled in a timely manner.
So managing all their care, their case management, basically.
Right. Case management is not emotionally neutral for most people. The system is not set up to be supportive of the patient's mental health. We'll just put it that way.
Right.
Right. And it is stressful to sit on hold and have things that should be covered, not covered, and have there be pushback on something that's important, right?
Right. And if you're not right on in the present moment, you can bring into that the entire history of your child, and that whole fear response is,
absolutely
activated.
You're not telling the worst moment of your life to someone who is supportive of you. And that's hard, right?
Yes.
You're telling the worst moments of your life to someone who is trying not to pay. So
it's not funny, but it's exactly. Yeah.
It's a lot to ask.
Yes.
So
that's another type of trauma.
Yeah. It is absolutely a type of trauma. It is important when it comes to trauma to be careful who you tell your sad stories to, who you tell your scary stories to. Because if the person does not handle that well, it matters.
Yes, it does.
And we, as a given, expect people in the medical system to tell their scary stories to people who aren't safe. So the parent is navigating all of that while trying to stay present with the child. And that's where I think sometimes in the medical field, there's a misunderstanding. Parents get misunderstood a lot in the medical field, I think, because the doctor regularly sees patients, and the doctor is able to not get super distressed by that. I mean, there's definitely...
They couldn't be able to perform their job if they were getting jacked all the time by their patients.
Well, we talk about it as burnout. With therapists, we talk about it as burnout.
Okay.
And even with doctors, sometimes they talk about burnout. But burnout is you witness lots of awful stuff, and you're not necessarily able to process it efficiently. And then it's a lot harder to do your job. Okay. Yeah. But we talk about strategies for managing burnout. You develop some objectivity. You set up boundaries. You know the difference between what's going on internally with you and what's going on internally with the patient. You don't take it home. These are the things that we tell therapists and that we tell doctors. And then, if they go do kind of trauma therapy, they're talking about individual events as opposed to the parent.
Right.
Because not only is the parent managing a lot more events because they're always there
24/7,
but it is important that the parent not be objective.
Right.
It is important that the parent, in a boundaried sort of way, recognize that this child, it is their job. It is parent's job to make sure that the child is going to go through all this scary stuff, that the child is not going to go through it alone. Because as we know from any horror movie you've ever seen ever, the way to scare somebody in a lasting, memorable way is to have something really awful happen and have them be alone. Okay?
Right.
Alone is the worst. The worst part of scary is alone. And so a parent's job, if they are going to support their child in the medical system, is to be attuned to the child when the child is in distress, so that the child can have two people holding on to it and managing it, rather than just a little kid who has no experience dealing with scary things whatsoever.
Right. They need an anchor.
Right. So they're not supposed to be objective. They're supposed to be attuned. And so that means that they're having to manage all of the distress and then metabolize all of the distress, rather than having the distress hit that wall of objectivity so that they're not overly rattled by the situation, right?
Right.
And I think for a lot of parents, it is difficult to let all of the stress of that, all the fear of that, parents witnessing really horrific things happening to their kids, and then they can't fully let it go because they're going home and they're still scared, and they're wondering what this is going to mean for their future, and they're wondering what this is going to mean for their child's future, because they care what happens to their child in the future, and not in a this is my patient and I care about my patient kind of way, but in a this is my child and I love my child and my heart is breaking kind of way.
Exactly. It's like a huge vector.
Right.
Yeah.
And that parent is still the person who is keeping the child from being alone. We talk about despair behaviors in our society. Addiction is a classic despair behavior. There's a lot of people who've written about trauma histories and addiction, that not every person with a trauma history becomes an addict, but every addict has a trauma history, right? It's a despair behavior.
Yes.
Okay?
Yeah.
And there are other despair behaviors that you see more commonly in caregivers, like hypervigilance. Or you see people developing somatic symptoms.
Absolutely.
Chronic illness is a huge, huge problem in caregivers. And the literature has been more focused on noticing the somatic symptoms of caregiving in elderly spouses, right? It's very common.
Right.
One member of the couple gets sick, the other one dies before the sick one dies, right?
Yes.
Or gets, their health is dramatically impacted. We see that all the time in the elderly, and it's easier to flag because their bodies are more vulnerable, right? But we definitely see that in caregivers of medically complex kids.
Absolutely. And I've shared my own personal history with, struggling with addiction and going into, treatment. The fact that I was managing several special needs kids never was really fleshed out or mentioned,
Nope.
So I've had personal experience, and yes, it's so needed.
And whether the despair behavior is addiction, or whether it's hypervigilance, or whether it becomes chronic illness, or whether it is despair. I mean, people talk a lot about there's passive suicidal ideation is a huge problem that nobody talks about.
Nobody wants to talk about it.
Parents of medically complex kids. Yeah, it's a scary thing to say. It's like, I can never die because my child will not be safe, but I am not happy or okay in the life that I have. You hear people say that.
Yes, and having been in case management for a long time, there's periods where, I feel like I move in and out of that at times, and I'm so grateful that there's an awareness growing of this because,
And then you also see kind of on the other side of it, you see parents getting really angry and frustrated with their children because their children aren't making milestones. And it's because there gets to a point where it's like, I can't, whether the parent's conscious of it or not, there's a level of, I can't be okay unless you are making these milestones because this is too much to handle. And my system's in distress here. Right. And that's not the parent being, parents not doing anything wrong if they're noticing themselves kind of getting into that headset.
Spiraling a little bit, or
because it's a sign of overwhelm and distress.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we are going to help children be able to be scared and not alone, if we are going to help children be able to develop autonomy in the lives that they have, we need parents to be able to, whether or not the child makes a milestone, be separate from whether or not the parent feels distress.
Yes.
And that can be kind of a difficult thing in terms of moving from crisis mode into long-term lifestyle and more of an unconditional acceptance and positive regard kind of place with their child, right?
Yes.
But that is not something that that's not where most people start. That's where it is helpful for both the child and the parent to hopefully get to. But if you're going to get there, there's a grief in moving from the expectation of a launchable child to a potentially, kind of lifetime live with you child or some other situation.
Right. It's like you're always kind of being aware that you're falling off the norm, kind of, or you're stepping away from, what's expected of you.
Right. Well, I think that piece of it is critical too.
That might be
and this is another thing we don't talk about is the loss of community.
Yes.
Most parents of young children have peers that they regularly play date with their friends.
Right.
Or they may be able to, talk to other moms about how hard it is, right? Moms love to talk about how hard it is to parent in a playful kind of way.
Right.
Right. But the things that are so hard for them to deal with are things that are totally foreign to your experience if you have a medically complex child. And the things that a parent of a medically complex child would talk about as normal stuff that is so hard is horrific and out of a person's ability to relate if they have not lived it.
Absolutely.
So there's a huge loss of community. And even if you just talk about physically being at an event and your child needs you to be on them like a hawk to make sure that they are not eating food off of random people's plates or making sure that they are not doing something that's unsafe, right?
Right.
Most parents of neurotypical kids, if their children get to a certain age and are a certain level of independence, they will stand in a group and visit while their kids play. They will not necessarily be walking with the parent who is walking with the child who is needing the more constant supervision.
Yes.
They're not joining that parent. Right. That parent is separate.
And they're alone.
Is isolated and has lost community when there's more going on where community might be helpful.
Yes. I know for me, making a connection with people in the TSC community was really helpful and important to feel validated and like I could share, these experiences and people didn't kind of slip away slowly back out the door.
Absolutely. Well, there's a super helpful aspect to the Facebook groups and there's a double-edged sword there as well.
Yes.
Because on one hand, it feels so good to have community, so good to have people get it. And if you want to have lots of examples of how things could get worse for your child, and you want an opportunity to flood your imagination with lots and lots and lots of worries, it's really easy to feel that reading all the posts. Right?
Yes, absolutely.
The posts are great. Most people who are posting are the people who are in distress, which is good because they're the people who are reaching out and are needing connection.
Mm-hmm.
And are wanting to get support and help. And if you take all of those posts as evidence of what is probably going to happen to your child, and by extension, something that you're going to have to be able to emotionally manage and deal with, you can get really, really scared, especially early.
Yes,
you know?
absolutely. In fact, I couldn't read a lot of I had to step away. And I think looking back, I think it was kind of that, like, I don't want to play these situations out.